Greetings, wonderful viewers. Welcome to my channel, Chess and Tens. It's been a long while. I'm Nyameba here, and today we'll be looking at some games by African players at the World Cup. In the meantime, if you're just joining this channel, do also subscribe so you won't miss our videos in the future. If you're a subscriber too, well, thanks for sticking around for all this while. Okay, so the World Cup had a couple of players from Africa who unfortunately had to exit the first round. Most of them had to exit the first round. But we had players from Egypt, players from Uganda, one player from Uganda, one player from Nigeria, Femi, one player from Sudan, Ethiopia, and South Africa also had one player, but most of the players from Africa were from Egypt. Egypt had the highest number of representation in Africa in the World Cup, and I think Bassem was able to progress to the next round, but most of them had to exit at the first round, which is usually very common in the World Cup. The two games we'll be looking at today was played by a Ugandan, Haruna Insubuga, and also the Namibian FM, Dante Boykers. So in the first game, Haruna was paired against Jules Moussard from France, a grandmaster, rated 2600. So the rating difference was almost about 400. That's a really wide rating gap. To be able to give, the game ended in a draw, which to his credits is a very impressive performance considering the gap in rating. So the game started with a Caro-Kann e4, c6, d4, d5, e captures on d5, c captures on d5, bishop d3, knight c6, attacking the pawn on d5, and to which white responds with c3, defending the pawn. Knight f6 is played, and then bishop f4 is played. Black responds with bishop g4, developing the light squared bishop. The queen comes to b3, attacking the pawn on b7. Black plays, defending the pawn with queen d7, and knight d2. Knight develops to d2. Here, if knight f6 is played first, the bishop takes, and then we'd have a double pawn on white's side. White doesn't want that to happen, so he first prepares that development with knight d2. So now he can play knight f6 comfortably, and if black decides to take on f3, he recaptures with a knight on d2. E6 is played, and knight gf3 is played. Knight develops to f3, and bishop d6 is played. Black is having a lot of influence along, white is making a lot of influence along black's queen side with a dark square bishop here, and so black decides to trade off the dark square bishop. And although this pawn is hanging, if white decides to take immediately, black can recapture the pawn on b2 by attacking the queen on b8. So white castles and then black castles. Rook f e1 is played, taking advantage of the half open file here, and in the future to develop the knight to play the knight to e5. And black responds with bishop f5, which was a very rare move here. I think it's the first move that's played according to the Lead Chess database. And while white is aiming for the e5 square, black is equally aiming for the e4 square. And so if there's a capture, black would have two pawns and would have a stronghold on the e4 square. And that's exactly what happens. Now you know that black's knight can move on to e4, and in the same way white is also targeting the e5 square. Knight e5 is played immediately, and knight e4 is played immediately. So now the queen captures on b7, and white also regains the pawn in the center on e5. Now here, if white decides to play f3, white played knight b3, but if white decides to play f3, it looks like the queen is pinned to the rook. But black has a nice response. He can respond with rook to b8. This rook is preferable because when you play this rook to b8, you lose the other pawn. Rook to b8, and after queen moves, the knight, the queen plays to d6, and you can't take the knight because the queen would be hanging. And so the queen exchanges, gets out of the pin to exchange on d6. And this is exactly what would happen. This is drawish, and knowing that as white's knowing that he's the higher rated player is expecting the game to not be this drawish as early as possible. He wants to play a much more sharper game with the queens off the board, and with knights and rooks. This game would most likely be easier to hold than the variation he went for, so it wouldn't be necessary for him to play f3. He instead goes for knight b3, and after that rook comes to b8. The rook on f comes to b8. The queen goes to c6. Rook c8 is played. Queen a6, and then queen f4 is played, attacking the pawn on f2. The rook defends the attack on f2, and then h5 is played. So h5 intends to reach h4 and then h3, and then try and invoke some weaknesses on white's king side. And white decides to act quickly, bringing the queen back to the defense of the king side, and then black also immediately starts to play f5 with the same spirit of reaching f3 and then making the pawn on c3 very weak. So the point of playing a4 is to cause weaknesses on white's king side as well. So here, despite being the lower rated player, black is the one applying the more pressure on his opponent. And after the knight moves, because a4 is almost about to happen, black plays a4 regardless, and then now f3 is played. While it boots the knights away from the strong e4 square, you can imagine that it creates weaknesses, dark square weaknesses, along white's king side, which you'd find out would cause some trouble for white later in the game. Knight falls back to d6, and then the rooks double up on the open file here. Black intends to move the knight to the much stronger square, which is c5, and so has to defend the pawn on f5 before he can make that move. The knight falls back to c2, and he prepares placing the knight on c5 first with a queen exchange. White responds with rook d1, and then black responds with rook e8. So rook takes on e8, rook recaptures on e8, and then the pawn is taken. So here white could have chosen to exchange queens, but he preferred to attack instead by bringing the rook into the game and occupying the very dangerous second rank. So the rook placement on the second rank attacks the knight, so the knight moves away from that square, and then the queen comes here attacking the f2 square and threatening checkmate immediately. So now you can see that white's dark square weaknesses are beginning to cause trouble for him, and here the rook comes to defend on f2 by playing f1. By playing rook to f1, he's defending the mating threat on f2. But this is a problem for white because this allows the knight to get into the game with knight c4, aiming for the e3 square, which attacks the rook, and then the g2 square. And for that purpose, the much better move to play was knight d3. So after rook f1, knight c4 was played, and then queen d4 was played. After the queens were exchanged, here black had two options: to take the pawn or to play knight to e3, attacking the rook and then attacking the pawn here. However, I believe that black thought that he could play knight e3 anytime, and so decided to go for one pawn first before coming for the g2 pawn. So after taking on the pawn on g2, knight d5 was played, and now you can't play knight e3. He goes ahead and takes the second pawn, but it would have been much better for black to keep the activity and attack on the king side rather than coming for 2 pawns on black's queen side. Knight is attacked now. It falls back to d6, and now the white's knight attacks black's rook, and then black's pawn, the king side pawn, the king side passed pawn, the queen side passed pawn. Sorry. So you are faced with two choices. Do you keep your rook along the second file, the second rank, sorry, or do you keep the pawn? Let's say he decides to play this rook d2. That was what was played actually. White takes on a4, and then rook takes on d4. And here you can see that despite the fact that you've taken white's central pawn, you've also lost your passed pawn, which could have been dangerous for you. So in this particular position, it was much better for black to have played rook a3, maintain the passed pawn, and give up control of the rank here, the second rank, but keep the passed pawn to cause some troubles in the future. And black played in the game. Black played rook d2, takes, and here with despite being a pawn up, with all the pawns on one side of the board, it's most likely going to end in a draw. However, black decided to push ahead, and at a point even sacrificed two of his pawns, and had to now fight for a draw. So here it's black. Black is the one that is trying to push to win, but his opponent is a much stronger opponent, so I think it would have been a fair decision to just accept the draw here. But after many pawn pushes and a sacrifice here, it was black who now was down a pawn and had to fight for the draw. So the game went on until there were bare kings left on the board. So many moves later on. One pawn is taken, and now both rooks would have to sacrifice to prevent the opponent's pawn from queening, and we have bare kings on the board. And this was an impressive performance from Uganda's Haruna to be able to secure a draw against a much higher rated opponent. However, he lost the game too, and then had to exit the first round. In the second game, we have the FIDE master, Namibian FIDE master Dante Boykas, playing against the much higher rated Ivan Saric, with a difference in rating of about 500 points. And the game was a Sicilian game that went e4 c5, knight f3. This game also ended in a draw, which was impressive for the Namibian. d6, d4, c captures on d4, knight captures on d4, knight f6, knight c3, and then knight c6, which is the classical variation of the Sicilian, which is an opening I'm not really used to as black. I would usually play a6, which is the knight of variation, but some people prefer to play the classical variation. Regardless, a6 still could be played, and then g6 could also be played as well, even after playing knight c6 as early in this variation. Bishop g5 was played. Bishop e6. You play e6 because you don't want to have black capturing on f6 and causing you to have double pawns early in the game, and also to prepare the bishop to play e7. After queen d2, a6 is played. The white castles on queen side, setting up an attack, opposite side castling attack, and then black responds with bishop d7. f4 is played, and then b5 is played. So here, black knows that there's going to be pawn storm on the king side, and so he begins to do that first and doesn't commit to castling yet. Therefore, if black decides to push h4, h5, the effect of it wouldn't be as strong as black's pawn push on white's queen side. White plays a3 to counter a future b4, and the black plays rook to b8, preparing b4 regardless. Knight falls back to f3, then b4 is played. So after captures on b4, rook captures, and now you can see that there's an open file on white's queen side, and the queen could join in the attack any moment, and it looks very dangerous and risky for white here. But I believe that the Namibian had done his homework and was in this position very well prepared. As computer evaluation puts it at 0.0, but I wouldn't, as white, play any game close to this, because this is very scary to have to play a position like this. It's against a much stronger player. Is really impressive what he did in this opening. So here, white plays e5, and since black's king is in the center, it's better to strike in the center than to go for the flank. And the queen plays a5 here, already threatening checkmate with let's say you take on f6. The pawn is threatening to take the knight on f6, but you can't take right now, because if you take on f6, yeah, you lose instantly with queen a1 check, and then queen b2 checkmate. So instead, white plays king to b1, and then d captures on e5, and now the knight plays to a2. a2 is trying to force queen exchange here before he takes on e5. And what would have happened if white decided to take on e5? Then black has this check, and a lot of material will be lost here. You can't come here because of the check. You can't come here because then you lose by checkmate. So you're going to lose your queen after this check, and you'll be losing your queen. Or even worse, or you could lose your queen this way, check, and then white's losing the queen. The same thing happens if you think you found a tactic with bishop captures on f6, because you think that white wouldn't be able to recapture, and then you'd win by playing this. However, if you take on f6, the same thing goes, check, and then bishop takes here. Bishop plays a3 check, and white is losing. So in this position, knight a2 was a very critical response. It forces the queens off the board and takes away some of the pressure from white's king side. from white's castled queen side. Okay, so here knight plays e4, the bishop falls back to e3, the bishop e7, the bishop develops and attacks the knight on e4, the knight falls back to c5, and the bishop goes to c4, much better square, and also gives way for the rook to attack the bishop on d7. If the king castles immediately, the bishop on d7 would fall. And here black decides to sacrifice the exchange, because as you can see, all of black's pieces are very active squares, and the position on white's king side doesn't really look so good. And once black has castled king side, he can bring a swing over his rook and start attacking white's castled king on the queen side. Therefore, this was a very sane decision to make. And so he begins attacking the weak pawn. There are 3 pawns that are very weak, and black saw that he could take advantage of that. However, the Namibian defended very strongly. So the game goes on for a while, and here so black pushes his pawn to g5, the king comes to a2, king f7 is played, king b1 is played, the king marches all over down the board to g6, h6 is played, g4, and f4. Bishop g1 is played with nothing else to do. White has all his pieces where he wants them to be, and so shuffles the bishop back and forth, hoping for a draw. And here black plays knight e3, so the bishop takes the knight on e3, and black creates a pass pawn here, but doesn't look so dangerous because white has enough pieces to stop the progress of this pawn. So bishop takes on c5, knight captures on c5, rook captures on c5, and now the pawn here is actually being held very strongly by the bishop here. And white did a very good thing to start creating his own pass pawn here with c3. c3 was a move that was played with the intention of reaching to c4, but with the support of the rook on c1. So c4 was played, rook c3 was played, and now a5 and c5. Now after a4 was played, and now it looks like the bishop can be attacked, and there is not enough squares for it to move on to. Therefore, the pawn on a4 becomes weak, can be easily attacked. So the bishop had to vacate this diagonal and leave the defense of the a4 pawn. And if the bishop decides to defend the pawn from this side, then that leaves this pawn free to push forward and promote. So the pawn on c2 now becomes a very strong pass pawn. So the rook is the one that comes to defense of the pawn, but that also still allows c6 to be played. Now rook captures on d4, and black's only counterplay, which is the pass pawn on e2, sorry, confuses white a little bit. So here, for some reason, white's played king f2 instead of taking the pawn on e2, and that would have made things much more easier. But here there was a lot of time pressure, and I believe that may have confused white a lot, because he was probably seeing certain things that were in there, and so played king to f2. And now there was this check, sorry, there was rook e4. A much better move to play would have been to play bishop to c4, and then if white plays f3, rook g2, sacrificing the rook and allowing the pawn to queen. But you can't queen immediately, because if you queen, there's mate on f1, and so there's mate on f8, and so you have to pin the rook first, and then here this is most likely going to end in a draw, or yeah, it's most likely going to end in a draw. But white would have to be very precise about it, and playing against a strong grandmaster, I believe that the game would have ended differently. But after king f2, black played rook e4, threatening to queen here, so that forces white back onto the e1 square, and both sides were struggling with time here, so their moves were a little inaccurate. King c8 was played, check, rook comes to a8, check, king c7, rook a7, check, and there was a 3-move repetition here. However, both sides didn't want to go for the draw, because they were, but the stronger guy was trying to, Sarich was trying to bait Dante to go to snap out of the 3-move repetition and try and play for a win, despite white having the high advantage here. Because of the time pressure, it's very likely he could blunder, and white, knowing that he's having the upper hand here, yet being unable to find the perfect continuation, doesn't really also want to go for the draw. However, not finding anything, he continues to play on and plays, I think, for 2 more moves, repeats the position for 2 more moves before they both accept the draw. The game ends in a draw. So this was a very wonderful performance by the Namibian, who again went on to lose the second game and had to exit the first round. Alright, so that'll be all for today. But don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified of future videos. That'll be all for today. Goodbye.